The day my grandfather died was full of contradictions. On the one hand, I felt the weight of loss. He was the only person in the family who always believed in me and supported me. On the other hand, I understood that after his death, an inheritance awaited me. Everyone knew that my grandfather was a wealthy man. His business was thriving, his houses and land were generating income, and his bank accounts held sums that the rest of the family could only dream of. My family always looked down on me. I was the extra one, the one who hadn't achieved much, the one who didn't fit into their world of ostentatious wealth and empty talk about status. But my grandfather saw something more in me. He often said that he understood me better than anyone else, and he often repeated mysterious phrases about how everything will fall into place in its own time. His funeral was held in an old stone church, where relatives from all over the country gathered. People wore black suits and expensive dresses, but there was no grief in their eyes. Instead, there was greed and impatience. It seemed that for many, my grandfather's death was not a tragedy, but the beginning of a game where the main prize was his fortune. After the funeral, we all gathered at the mansion. The atmosphere there was thick and tense. People smiled tensely, exchanged glances, and whispered to each other. I felt that everyone was already mentally dividing up my grandfather's property. I also hoped that my life would change on that day. My grandfather had hinted more than once that he would not allow my relatives to humiliate me. I believed that I would be the main heir. Deep down, I dreamed that I would now be able to start all over again, realize my ideas, and prove to everyone that I was worthy of respect. In the evening, more than 20 people gathered in the living room. A folder with a seal lay on the long table, and all eyes were fixed on it. The lawyer, a man in his 50s, opened the documents and began to read. His voice sounded confident, and every word pierced the air like a hammer blow. At first, he read out the dispositions of minor items. A painting goes to one aunt, an antique clock to another relative, a collection of books to someone else. The relatives smiled and nodded in agreement, although their smiles hid their irritation. All this was just a prelude to the main event. Everyone was waiting for the moment when the lawyer would say, "And all other property is transferred." But that moment never came. Instead, the lawyer looked up and said, "And the deceased's last wish concerns his grandson." Silence fell over the room. I felt the hearts of the others freeze. I was sure this was it. Now everything would become clear. The lawyer took an envelope sealed with wax from the folder. My name was written on it. "This is a letter," he said. "The gentleman requested that you open it yourself." I took the envelope. It was thick and heavy, and at that moment it seemed to me that my entire fate was contained within it. My relatives froze, their eyes piercing me. I could feel the envy and hatred burning behind my back. I broke the seal. Inside were several pages written in my grandfather's handwriting. His handwriting was firm and strict. Every word seemed deliberate. "My boy," the letter began, "when you read these lines, I will no longer be here. I have left you neither property nor wealth. I have left you the truth. It is heavy, but it is what determines who you really are." I kept reading, and my heart sank. My grandfather confessed that I was not his grandson at all. He said that my mother had hidden the truth from me for many years. It turned out that my real father was a man I had never heard of. Moreover, my grandfather claimed that this was the reason why the whole family had always treated me differently, as if I were a stranger. "I loved you like my own son," he wrote. "But you must know, the blood of this family does not flow in your veins. You belong to a different story. And if you want to understand who you really are, start with what is hidden in the safe in my library." My head was spinning. The words danced before my eyes. Everything I believed in was crumbling. I expected to receive wealth, but instead I received the weight of the truth, which threatened to destroy my entire past. I looked up and saw the looks on my relatives' faces. They were looking at me with triumph. They didn't need to know the contents of the letter to sense that it had not brought me wealth. For them, it was confirmation of their victory. I left the room, holding the letter in my hands. My grandfather's last words echoed in my head. "In the safe, you will find something that will change everything." My grandfather's library was on the second floor. I closed the door behind me and walked over to a massive cabinet. Behind it was a steel safe door. I knew the code. My grandfather had trusted me with it while he was still alive. Inside was a thin folder with documents and a small wooden box. I opened the folder. There were photographs, copies of letters, newspaper clippings. All of it concerned a man named Daniel, the man my grandfather called my real father. Next was the box. It contained an old key and a small pendant. The pendant was engraved with a date that meant nothing to me. But something about this object seemed important, like a clue. I closed the safe, but inside I was boiling. This was not an inheritance, it was a test. Instead of money and power, I received a mystery that could turn my life upside down. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time. I saw the faces of my family, satisfied and confident that I was left with nothing again. But they didn't know. I had something they didn't. The truth. And that truth led me into the unknown. That's when I decided to go all the way. I would find the answers, even if it meant destroying the whole world I knew before. The days that followed were not easy. The revelation about my uncle had stirred something inside me, a mixture of anger, confusion, and a hunger for answers. I could no longer look at family gatherings the same way, nor could I hear his name without remembering the lies that had been spun around my childhood. It wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about reclaiming the truth that had been stolen from me. I began piecing together fragments of conversations I had overheard as a child, moments when adults whispered behind closed doors, or when my mother would quickly change the subject if my uncle's name was mentioned. Those fragments, once insignificant, now became puzzle pieces in a picture I had never been allowed to see. The first place I turned to was the attic of my childhood home. Dusty boxes stacked haphazardly, old photo albums, and forgotten letters filled the space. I spent hours there, sometimes until the early morning, digging through the remnants of a life I thought I understood. Each photograph felt like a clue. In some, my uncle stood too close, his hand resting on my mother's shoulder with a familiarity that felt unsettling. In others, he was absent altogether, as though deliberately erased from the record. One evening, after hours of searching, I stumbled across a small, worn journal bound in cracked leather. It belonged to my grandmother, a woman whose silence had always seemed heavier than her words. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate, each word pressed into the paper, as though she had been determined to preserve it. I read by the dim light of a single bulb, my hands trembling as I turned each fragile page. The entries revealed truths I was never meant to know. My grandmother had been aware of the affair between my mother and her brother-in-law, my so-called uncle. She had tried to confront her to stop it, but her efforts had been drowned out by shame and fear of destroying the family. There were mentions of arguments, of sleepless nights, of secrets too heavy to carry. The final entries suggested that my father had once suspected the truth, but chose to bury his suspicions to protect me. I felt the air leave my lungs as I read. It wasn't just my uncle who had betrayed me. It was my mother, my grandmother, and perhaps even my father. All of them had known, or at least suspected, and yet no one had ever told me. The world I thought I knew had been built on silence and half-truths. Fueled by anger and desperation, I decided I needed to confront my mother directly. I could no longer play the role of the obedient son who accepted her words without question. I rehearsed what I would say, how I would demand the truth, how I would force her to admit what she had done. The confrontation happened on a rainy night. I remember the sound of the storm outside, rain lashing against the windows, thunder rumbling like an ominous warning. My mother sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea, as if the world around her were calm and ordinary. I stood in the doorway, holding the journal in my hands, my voice trembling but firm. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, placing the book on the table between us. Her eyes flicked to the journal, and in that moment, I saw the truth written across her face. She didn't deny it. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, her shoulders slumped, and she let out a long, weary sigh. "You weren't supposed to find that," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the rain. I demanded answers. I demanded explanations. Why had she lied to me all these years? Why had she let me believe my uncle was just family, when in reality he had been so much more? Her responses were fragmented, defensive, and tinged with regret. She claimed she had wanted to protect me, that the truth would have destroyed the fragile family we had left. But her words only fueled my anger. Protect me? Or protect herself? Protect her reputation, her comfort, her ability to go on as if nothing had happened. The storm outside felt like an echo of the storm within me. The argument escalated until her voice broke, and tears spilled down her cheeks. For the first time in my life, I saw her not as a mother, but as a flawed woman who had made choices that rippled through generations. She begged me to forgive her, to understand, but forgiveness felt impossible in that moment. I left the house that night, slamming the door behind me, the rain soaking through my clothes as I stumbled into the darkness. My mind was spinning, my heart heavy. The truth had set me free from the illusion, but it had also chained me to a pain I had never known before. In the days that followed, I isolated myself. I stopped answering calls, stopped responding to messages, and withdrew from the people who thought they knew me. I couldn't face them, not when I barely knew myself anymore. Every memory of my childhood now felt tainted, every smile forced, every family dinner staged. But amid the chaos, a single thought grew louder. If my family had been willing to keep such monumental secrets from me, what else had they hidden? The journal hinted at more, at arguments about money, about betrayals beyond infidelity, about alliances formed in the shadows. I realized that the truth I had uncovered was only the beginning. And so, with a determination I had never felt before, I decided I wouldn't stop. I would dig deeper, no matter how painful, no matter what I uncovered. If my entire life had been a lie, then I needed to strip away every layer until I reached the core, even if it destroyed me. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that my family wasn't just guilty of one secret. They were entangled in a web of lies that spanned decades. Every day felt like walking through a maze where the wall shifted when I thought I had finally found the way out. The truth was never straightforward. It always twisted, turned, and dragged me deeper. I spent nights reading and rereading my grandmother's journal. Her words became an obsession. I analyzed every entry, every unfinished sentence, every subtle implication. It was as if she had left me breadcrumbs to follow, but each crumb only led to another dark corridor. She had known about my mother's affair, but she also hinted at something darker: money gone missing, inheritances fought over, threats exchanged in whispers. One entry stood out. "If he ever finds out, everything will collapse. We've built too much on this foundation of silence." I stared at those words for hours, wondering who he was. My father? My uncle? Or me? The question haunted me until I decided to confront the only other person who might know more, the stranger who had approached me at the funeral. Finding him wasn't easy. He had appeared out of nowhere, whispered his secret, and vanished just as quickly. But I remembered his face, tired eyes, a crooked nose, and a scar along his jawline. I started asking around, describing him to anyone who had been at the service. Most shook their heads, but finally, one of my father's old friends said, "That sounds like Daniel. Haven't seen him in years. He and your father were close once, but something tore them apart." That was enough for me. After weeks of digging through records, making calls, and even driving to places I hadn't been in years, I finally tracked him down. He lived in a rundown apartment on the edge of the city, the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. When he opened the door, he looked older, more worn, but I recognized him instantly. "You found me," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. I stepped inside, the air thick with cigarette smoke and stale beer. The place was cluttered, papers scattered across the table, as if he had been waiting for someone like me. "I need answers," I told him. "You can't just whisper something like that at my father's funeral and disappear. Tell me what you know." Daniel studied me for a long time, his eyes narrowing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he motioned for me to sit. "You want the truth? Fine. But once you hear it, you'll wish you hadn't." I braced myself. He told me about the affair. That much I already knew, but he went further. My uncle hadn't just betrayed my father. He had manipulated him for years. Business deals, investments, money siphoned off little by little, until my father was left with almost nothing. My childhood, the modest life we lived, the sacrifices my father made, they weren't by choice. They were because my uncle had bled him dry. And my mother? She had been complicit. She wasn't just a victim of temptation. She had chosen the comfort and security my uncle offered, even if it meant betraying the man who had raised me. But the most devastating truth came last. Daniel leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your father knew. He knew everything. But he stayed. He stayed because of you. He didn't want you to grow up broken, bouncing between homes, caught in the crossfire. So he swallowed his pride, he endured the humiliation, and he let the world believe the lie, just so you could have a family." I sat frozen, unable to process the weight of it all. My father, the man I had buried with so many unanswered questions, had carried this burden alone. He had chosen silence, not out of weakness, but out of love. And I had never thanked him. Tears blurred my vision as Daniel's words echoed in my mind. For the first time, I felt the true depth of my father's sacrifice. He hadn't been the perfect man, but he had been the only man who had truly put me first. I left Daniel's apartment that night with a heaviness in my chest that I couldn't shake. The rain poured again, just as it had on the night I confronted my mother, and I let it soak me as I walked through the empty streets. But this time, the storm didn't feel like chaos. It felt like cleansing. I knew what I had to do. The next day, I returned to my mother's house. She looked older than I remembered, her eyes swollen from nights of crying. For a moment, I almost pitied her. But then I remembered the lies, the betrayals, the years of silence, and pity turned to resolve. We sat across from each other, the tension so thick it felt like another presence in the room. I told her everything Daniel had revealed, every detail of the truth she had tried to bury. She didn't deny it. She couldn't. Her silence was confession enough. "I can't forgive you," I said finally, my voice steady. "Not now. Maybe not ever. But I won't let your lies define me anymore. I am my father's son, not because of blood, but because of the choices he made. And nothing you or he did will ever take that away from me." Her tears flowed freely, but I felt nothing. The bond between us had been severed, and I had no desire to mend it. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild my life. I sold my mother's house, the house filled with ghosts and memories I no longer wanted. I cut ties with relatives who had known and stayed silent. And I started fresh, carrying with me only the lessons my father had left behind. But the story doesn't end there. Because even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, haunted by questions that may never be answered. Did my father ever resent me for the sacrifices he made? Did my mother ever truly love him, or me? Was my uncle still out there, living comfortably off the ruins of our family? I may never know. What I do know is this: the truth is rarely simple, and it is never painless. But it is necessary. And though it shattered me, it also set me free. I am no longer the boy who grew up in ignorance, sheltered by lies. I am the man who knows the weight of sacrifice, the sting of betrayal, and the power of truth. And that truth, as ugly as it is, belongs to me.